So I think I'm going to begin now. We've just kind of paused for about 5 minutes to give everybody time to join. And First of all, a very warm welcome. I'm Vikram Mathur. I'm the Director of Transitions Research, and very happy to have all the panelists and participants and attendees uh, joining us for our dialogue on building a net zero society. This dialogue is part of a series that Transitions Research conducts, a series of dialogues, we call them Talking About Transitions, which feature critical conversations on the shifts at the interplay of technology, society, and sustainability. And our dialogues provide a platform for thinking together about three major areas of change and challenge: urbanization, climate change, and digitalization. Uh, the building a net zero society, today's dialogue takes place on Urban October. Today is the World Cities Day, and so we are very happy to host this dialogue today, and also see it as a way to launch an important initiative that we are going to work on for the next few years. Just to set the context a little bit, cities are must have to be at the forefront of climate action. Transitions research is particularly interested in cities, in growing mid-sized cities in India, which are going to define India's urbanization story, and the number of these cities is going to increase from about 120 to 160 for this decade. And they kind of fall in a policy blind spot, right? So our commitment is to work in these growing mid-sized cities, and as everybody is aware, that India has made fairly ambitious commitments to net zero commitments nationally, but also more than 60 cities in India have pledged net zero futures. And as we work with these cities and we talk to these cities, we find that a lot of the conversations around net zero are very technology focused. Net zero is an idea that has emerged in the physical sciences, and we feel it's particularly important for us to think through what a net zero society will look like. And there are a host of kind of emission inventories and technology prediction and techno-economic projections into the future. But I think there is a limited understanding of how such a scientific concept like net zero is going to be interpreted by institutions and communities and and policymakers. So the focus of our work on net zero is on the social dimensions of net zero transitions, and that is what we are going to discuss today. I also want to mention very briefly about our urban living lab, which is called PUL, and we call it People's Urban Living Lab. This is something that we had set up a few years ago in the city of Panjim, and we are now taking it forward more across the country, and will work in at least 3 to 4 Indian cities to use the PUL platform, the Urban Living Lab platform and approach to explore net zero trajectories. And the specific thing about the lab idea is that these are kind of platforms or innovation gardens to test out technological solutions. So what are the, to actually kind of test out solutions, net zero solutions in the real life laboratory of the city. So that's a very quick introduction and sort of setting context for this particular talk and this particular dialogue. And we have three really exciting, interesting panelists, and I will quickly introduce them now. First, we have Dr. Shiraz Vaji. He's an ecologist by training, and he's worked on issues of climate sustainability for the past 40 years. He's the president of the Gorakhpur Environmental Action Group, and is a kind of teacher, mentor, facilitator of many exciting initiatives and projects around sustainability and development in the Indian context. In terms of international panelists, we have Christina Lonkaukova, and she is a principal advisor at the Behavioral Insights team. We came across her work where she had co-authored a flagship report on how to build a net zero society in the context of the UK, and we thought it was a very exciting and interesting framing, and we thought it would be good to hear her thoughts on this issue. And then finally, I have my colleague Ashali Bhandari, who leads the Future Cities program at Transitions Research. She also is leading the Urban Living Lab, which is part of the Future Cities initiative, and she is an urban planner and does a lot of exciting work around mapping various urban spaces and is interested also working on gender and climate change in the context of cities, and has done really exciting work in the first phase of the pull on women's access to walking and non-motorized transport in the city of Panjim. So she brings with both kind of technical skills, but also social science perspectives. So that's a brief kind of introduction to the panelists, and to kick off the conversation, I'm going to invite Ashali to make a really brief presentation of our pull project of Pull Net Zero. And then after that, we are going to pose some questions to our panelists, and hopefully we'll also have time for interaction with the audience towards the end of this conversation. There are also a bunch of house rules. I was reminded several times to make sure that I announce the house rules, and maybe my colleague Shanta has typed them up here. Yeah. No. Ashali, do you want to mention what these house rules are
Sure.
as you begin your presentation? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no,
I think the obvious one is that, we'll open up for questions in the end, and yeah.
No, thanks everyone
Ashali,
for
over
joining.
to you.
Yeah, thanks, Vikram. Thanks everyone for joining. Just really quick, the event is being recorded, and we will be putting it up on our website. And please use the chat and the Q&A features if you have any questions, and we'll collate them at the end. So thanks everyone for joining. On behalf of Transitions Research, I'm really excited to talk about our new project, Building a Net Zero Society. We'll be employing our People's Urban Living Lab, PUL, to develop net zero strategies for growing Indian cities. Santa, could I ask you to go 2 slides down, please? Yeah, thank you. 1 more, please. Thank you. So we believe that this is a really important time to have this conversation and think about our net zero transition. We believe that India's urban story is going to shape our climate future. And this is because Indian cities are growing rapidly, especially our mid-sized cities with a population between 300,000 and 1 million. As Vikram said, these cities are growing in number and also in population. By the end of this decade, there'll be 20 million more people moving into these cities, and there'll be 44 new cities added to our urban landscape. This means it's a great opportunity and a time to redesign and reshape our cities in a way to avoid locking into unsustainable ways of living that both result in increased greenhouse gas emissions and also increased vulnerability to climate risks, especially for marginalized communities. We all know that globally, the majority of greenhouse gas emissions come from our cities. About 70% of all emissions come from cities. So as India embarks on a net zero journey, it's really important that cities pioneer this transition. Next slide, please. And we believe we need new approaches and ways of doing things to actually achieve net zero and many other climate goals. Because, at this point in time, predict and provide traditional top-down urban planning methods are not working in our cities. We need approaches that are contextual and address local and rooted challenges. We need approaches that allow for meaningful stakeholder participation, especially of marginalized groups. We need approaches that are iterative, dynamic, and allow for co-creation and testing of solutions before we mainstream them at scale. And pull is that approach. We work to transform Indian cities into inclusive, exceptional places to live and thrive by co-creating, testing, and implementing equitable climate solutions. As Vikram mentioned, we launched Pull in 2020 under the ambit of Project Urban Living Lab. We worked in the city of Panjim with a couple of other partners, including the smart city of Panjim, to actually work on solutions and develop strategies around non-motorized transport, water resilience, and data-driven governance. But we've recently rebranded, so we're not Project Urban Living Lab, we're now People's Urban Living Lab, and we have this really exciting new project called Building a Net Zero Society. Next slide, please, Shanta. And as part of this project, we are looking at the social dimensions, the social transformations that are needed to actually build a net zero society. The project is unique because, like Vikram said, we're working in mid-sized cities, which have traditionally been a policy blind spot, but have the most opportunity to test new imaginations for what the future holds. We also center people and not carbon at the core of our net zero solutions. We believe that net zero transitions have to be inclusive, they have to be equitable, and that means that our pathways to get there have to have development co-benefits. They need to include everyone and important urban agendas that are not only climate focused. And finally, we focus on human choice and behavior change because all of us need to adopt new lifestyles to actually reduce emissions and address climate change. So as we develop net zero strategies that are focused on social transformations, we do take a four-pronged approach. Santa, next slide, please. So our approach, kind of like I said, it's four-pronged. First, we employ participatory methods. We think about things like ethnography, participatory mapping, imagination workshops, focus group discussions to really learn and understand challenges in their local rooted context. And then we work with communities, private sector, governments to co-create solutions to actually address climate challenges. We engage with civil society, government, and private sector to create new institutional arrangements and build the capacity to actually implement solutions because we may not necessarily have the frameworks right now to already do this. And finally, we test these ideas in the real life laboratory of neighborhoods and cities to inform implementation at scale before we mainstream climate solutions. It's important to make sure they work and they have political and social acceptance and buy-in. Next slide, please. So I'm basically done with a really quick presentation. I know everyone's here to listen to our exciting panelists, but if you'd like to learn more about Project Urban Live, our People's Urban Living Lab, our new project, Building a Net Zero Society, you can go to our website and under the Initiatives tab, we have a new pull page. You can read more about our latest publications, our reports, and what we've done in the past. Oh, thanks, Shanta. So yeah, here's a quick little snippet of our website. It's transitionsresearch.org/pull. So yeah, check it out. I'm sure we'll also put this in the chat for everyone to see. And yeah, Vikram, over to you again. Thanks.
Excellent. We already have a question, but I'm going to ask Noah to allow us to hold this towards the end of this program. But I've noted the question, and I'll come to the panelists with it. I would like to kind of begin the discussion. Kind of open it up to a wide set of thoughts, and fundamentally, I think. I'm going to kind of step back, like just before India made its commitment for net zero 2070, there was a lot of debate in the Indian policy community whether this is the right strategy for us to pursue or it's not the right strategy to pursue, because 2070 is far away, and it just seems like it's a monumental task, and even if we make these projections that we'll have 30% renewable and we'll have 70% that and 20% this, how do we as a society, how do we transition to a net zero future? What does a net zero society look like? So that's my kind of opening question. Maybe I'll start with Shiraz. and ask you to kind of dwell on this, and then we'll pose the same question to all the panelists, and then I'm going to get back to the panelists with very specific questions. Shiraz, over to you.
Thank you, Vikram. And I think I would like to first of all congratulate Transition Research for initiating this discussion. Actually, I mean, there are some critiques also on the net zero pathways and the ambitious targets of net zero mechanisms. But at the same time, it is very good and nice to see that in the whole discussion, you have put the citizens, the community in the centerpiece, as the centerpiece, and looking the whole issue of transition and the resilience from the eyes of the community who are living in the cities, especially the mid-sized cities or the cities which are in the transition phase from a smaller city to mid-sized city, again to mid-sized cities to the larger cities and so on. So, I mean, while we talk on the transition of and I mean moving towards net zero, I would like to highlight a few points. Like one of the things is that the whole issue of natural ecosystems, how the natural ecosystems are located in the city and what role they contribute, especially, I mean, if we are talking of the poor communities and the urban poor. So there is a direct kind of connect between the natural ecosystems and the people, especially the poor people living in the cities. But at the same time, what we are observing is that gradually these natural ecosystems are in a degeneration process, and there's a low priority actually for protecting these natural ecosystems for the benefit of the urban poor. So that is something actually, and these ecosystems, climate change or no climate change, they have been providing the resources and the ecosystem services to the local communities. And the whole issue of commercialization in the cities is actually impacting the natural ecosystem. So that is something actually which will have to be thought of while we look at the ambitions of net zero cities. So that is the first one. The second point which I would like to highlight here is that the whole issue of enabling urban system. The resource poor urban dwellers, like, I mean, people who are walking, people who are using bicycles, people who are taking non-fossil fuel based mechanisms, they, I mean, what is the system actually, what is the mechanism in an urban setup which help them or which is against them? So the whole target or the whole ambition of the cities to grow is in the direction that is not very helpful for these urban poor or people who are less polluting, less problem causing kind of things. And in that process, actually, it is both the infrastructure of the city and the governance mechanisms. Like, I mean, in the cities, if we measure the walkability index, the comfort or the convenience of walking in the cities, that is something which is quite alarming, the way things are degenerating. So, I mean, the whole infrastructure as well as the governance, both are important to be seen there. The third point which I would like to highlight here is the whole issue of infrastructure and the livability of the people, the urban poor in the cities. The whole housing designs, like, I mean, how much ventilation is being protected. The rich can have the air conditioners, but poor people actually, I mean, they depend on the ventilation. So the housing designs, and especially the housing actually, which is taken up under some government scheme, that will have to ensure the kind of ventilation and the mechanisms which help a net zero society. The fourth point will be for the whole contribution of the peri-urban areas. The peri-urban areas actually, and they provide the food as well as the resilience to the city, or the food and the livelihood to the people living in those areas. But at the same time, it is also providing the resilience to the city. And there is kind of intercomplementarity between the food systems, the livelihood, and the resilience of the city. But unfortunately, the way the peri-urban spaces are seen and they are addressed, that is not something actually which is helping. So that is also, I mean, the peri-urban areas, I mean, these are not a chaotic space, in which unorganized development is happening, but it has to be some kind of, because they are going to be the part of the city tomorrow. So I mean, when we see the growing and the growth of the cities, these are the cities in waiting kind of thing. So I mean, the peri-urban spaces will have to be seen with those lenses, and that is also something which is important for the net zero society. And the last thing is that when we are talking of the cities, the net zero plans for a particular city in a particular agroclimatic context, that is also something which is very, very important. But every city has a different kind of mechanisms and a different kind of setup of the problems as well as the opportunities and the ecology. So in that context, the local city plans for the net zero will have to be evolved through the sub-city level kind of mechanisms like a ward or a zone, or so the plans will have to be bottom-up approach where the location specific plans are developed into the ward plans leading to the city plans, and there the learning gardens, or I mean the innovation garden kind of concept can be very well inbuilt in the mechanism. So these are some of the points which I would like to highlight here, and then we can also discuss in the question answer session. Thank you.
Thanks, Shirad. Over to you, Christina.
Thank you. So yeah, so I'll go back to that original question, that big question: how do we build a net zero society? And unsurprisingly, I'll echo some of the points raised just now. But I'd like to start by just really welcoming the approach that transition research has taken to this question. I think one big point to really highlight here is that if we want to build a net zero society, achieving behavior change is as important, if not more important, than technological change that we have been largely focusing on for now. There is research actually showing that excuse me, the majority, 65% of future emissions reductions will need to come from changes in people's behavior across different areas of energy, transport, food, and broader consumption. Now, a lot of this has to do with technology uptake. So, say electric cars, of course, are not just about us developing them, but of course, about actually encouraging people and creating conditions for them to take them up. But on top of this, there are some emissions reductions that we can only achieve through people's behavior. Say, getting people to reduce how much meat they eat, or encouraging them to walk or cycle more, or to recycle. So a lot of the actions that we need to happen for net zero are intrinsically behavioral. But of course, the big challenge when trying to build a net zero society is that, and you'll know that from your own experience, often these kind of more sustainable green behaviors are these days typically more difficult for people to take up. There are big barriers for them to engage with net zero. Many surveys across the world show that people are very concerned about climate change, but also they don't necessarily always know what it is that they could do, how they could change their behavior to help us get there. Many people don't know what the different actions they are taking on a daily basis, what impact they have, how they relate to net zero. For instance, in our research, we've seen that people think that recycling more or using less plastic is as good as, say, cutting on long-haul flights. So I guess going back to your question, we definitely need to start by providing better information to people, really kind of enabling them by giving them better understanding of what are some of these actions they can take, how important they are. But also then separately, as was addressed, there is this big piece around how can we make it easier, more attractive, more social, more timely for people to take these behaviors up. And that is because as behavioral scientists, we know that often our behaviors are not necessarily only result of our attitudes, but have to do with, say, our environment and how the choices that we have are presented and structured and framed. So, you know, if we are trying to encourage people to take up more public transport, but we don't have enough of the right kind of connections there, people perceive it to be unsafe, maybe it's even expensive, then of course it would be it wouldn't be the right approach for us to try to encourage them to do it without, as local councils, as governments, as public authorities, first changing some of those conditions. So the change has to come from upstream. It has to come from planners who will look at this ambition of 2017 net zero and work backwards from that and design systems that make it easier for people to make these changes. So that might include, as was mentioned, changing the infrastructure and building it in a way that enables some of these behaviors, thinking about ways how we can make it more attractive. So maybe that will have to do with some cost incentives and other rewards that we can provide. And also thinking about how we can make these behaviors kind of more popular and more kind of aligned with timing of people's lives. But maybe again, I can tell you a bit more about some of those examples from the UK and beyond later.
Much, Christina. Shali, over to you. Same question.
Yes, sounds good. Thanks, Vikram. So I think before I get into like what are the societal transformations we need, I just want to take a step back to be good question, like why do we need this societal approach, right? And like Vikram said in the introduction, net zero is a technical scientific concept, but we see that countries and corporations and now cities are adopting these targets, right? And to actually achieve this goal, we need to understand what we're working towards, and we need to think about implementing it in the social, economic, political context of our cities and our countries. So of course, like Christina mentioned, behavior change is a huge component of actually working towards net zero. We need societal changes in the sense of normative shifts, and we need nudges and ways to make it easy, attractive, and timely, right, to actually adopt new behaviors. Like Shazji said, we need to really think about contextual, geographically rooted challenges. We need to think a lot about communities and what they aspire for, what their needs are, because they may not necessarily have climate change goals in mind. They may have other important development agendas that are their priorities first. But I also think it's really important to think about two other things that we are doing as part of PULL. And one is thinking a little bit about a shared vision for what a net zero future looks like. Because if we don't know what net zero futures mean and what they look like, it's really hard to build consensus, to get stakeholder buy-in and identify pathways to actually get there. We need, to collaborate amongst diverse stakeholders to actually get to net zero. And if we kind of can, as part of PULL, if we can work to address contestations and divergent views and align values and create this shared vision, we'll all be able to work together and actually try and achieve net zero. Second, I think it's really important to think about achieving and implementing net zero in the context of our current governance frameworks, like Shrazdi was talking about. India, our cities, our governance frameworks can be fragmented. They can be a bit siloed, especially when it comes.
Am I the only one who lost Shali?
No, she doesn't.
Okay, sorry. So we'll, maybe she's having some internet trouble. So we'll continue. So thanks very much, everybody, for your first round of responses. I'm going to have kind of some specific follow-up questions and I'll start with Shirazji. And I think just going back to what you said, that there was not, when the whole this net zero conversation started in India, we didn't really have a complete consensus of buy-in, even of the voices who speak on climate. And one of the reasons was that it was always thought that India's priority should be poverty reduction. It should be, addressing issues of access, inclusion in the city, and perhaps net zero futures are not necessarily just futures, right? So obviously that critique has been accepted, and now the rhetoric is around just transitions. But my kind of question to you is, can net zero pathways support, in your view, immediate goals of poverty reduction, access, and inclusion in the cities? Is there a way to marry these two objectives somehow? And are there any potential trade-offs? So, for example, I began to see, when you talked about commercialization of nature in cities for net zero projects, we see that is also sometimes could lead to circling or kind of enclosure of those commons, and reduce access of urban poor who might need them for food security and other ecosystem services. So that for me is an example of a trade-off, and we are exploring that trade-off in more depth. But I just want to try to understand from you if you feel like net zero pathways can align with development aspirations, and if not, what are the potential trade-offs and pitfalls?
So thank you, Vikramji, for highlighting this point. And actually, I was very happy to read the introduction which Transition Research had given. And I mean, actually, the thing is that when we started thinking and working on urban, whole issue of urban climate resilience, 2004, 5, and so on, I mean, the whole focus was like data and a top-down approach for kind of a generic solution for the problems actually which was being observed at that time. And actually, I mean, that gradually shifted towards kind of more inclusive processes, and how the people actually, or the citizens in the cities, can be engaged, and the human element actually that was inbuilt in the resilience mechanism. Same way, I mean, what I think that, I mean, if the net zero process, although I mean there is a large number of years till 2070, but still, I mean, if we take the pathway, which is not only merely physical data-centric kind of approach, which is more generic, but more kind of city-specific, Ashali was using the word shared vision. So, I mean, if we have the citizens in the center and can have, I mean, this process can have the people's view and inclusive kind of planning and implementation, that will be helpful. But yes, I mean, to answer the question directly, there is kind of complementarity between net zero as well as the livelihood of the people, or the poverty in the cities, or the development of the city. If the understanding and the capacity of the city and the city governance actually is built in that process, and the citizens' engagement is ensured. So the aspirations of the citizens, and on one hand, and the net zero targets on the second hand, how this intercomplementarity can be started from the bottom-up approach, like, I mean, at a mohalla level, kind of to the ward level, and to the city level. So that intercomplementarity between the two is very important. And if that is ensured, I think there is quite a lot of possibility and scope for building net zero cities. If I could answer your question, I don't know.
No, thanks very much for that. Yeah, so fortunately or unfortunately, I mean, I sometimes feel like a lot of these conversations, I have a deja vu, that this was a conversation that has happened before in the development space. And I think from a developing country perspective, I feel like we have to emphasize this co-benefits approach. continue to, even if we move fast forward, full throttle towards the net zero future. I'm going to come back to you, Christina, with a more specific question. And we are at Transitions Research. We've been doing some work on kind of behavioral change. I'm myself an anthropologist, so I sometimes think that norms, values, normative shifts are really important for behavioral change, and some of the more the nudges, as you call them, are perhaps not as effective. And I mean, a classic example is private vehicles in India, and they're continuing to grow. The amount of SUVs that people are buying is increasing, and because there's a norm associated with private car ownership, of prestige, of social status, and so on and so forth, and EVs, I think, are halfway houses. So how do we bring about deep change, deep behavioral change, and what is your experience from other initiatives and programs where you have looked at both the kind of nudges framework that's very popular, as also the more kind of value-based framework for social and behavioral change? And so would love to have some thoughts on that.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. Yeah, I think it is a very, very good point. And I think in any case, the kind of nudge methodology, which maybe I should explain for people who are not familiar with it. So the idea is that, nudges are these kind of small changes, small tweaks that we can make to the existing kind of environment, which don't materially change the kind of conditions in a sort of substantial way, but can have sometimes surprisingly big effects. I guess to give you an example, the behavioral insights team where I work here in the UK started applying nudges in the context of tax collection, where we found that changing one sentence in the kind of standardly, routinely sent out letter to people who were paying late, that changing just that one sentence, actually, Vikram, to your point, using social norms there, letting them know that the majority of people actually pay on time, can lead to increase in timely payment. Okay? So that's an example of a nudge, right? Kind of small change, drawing on behavioral science, so on our knowledge and understanding of how people think, behave, and make decisions. But it is not a big kind of structural change. We haven't introduced a new larger fine for these taxis. We haven't introduced some kind of stronger punishments or anything of the sort. And so from our kind of perspective and experience here in the UK, but also in other countries, what we find is that these nudges definitely can work and can have a kind of contributing effect, particularly where you really kind of are trying to target those changes at the environment where people operate. And I'll give you some examples. But of course, they can never on their own solve this issue. You need those big changes. You need big decisive action from government, exactly as you say, to change the kind of norms, to change the culture and the perception of what is normal, right? So as here in the UK, by 2035, the government has committed to the idea of the kind of ban on selling new petrol and diesel vehicles. That sends a very strong norm that we definitely want at that level. But we have complemented it with a small nudge, which is has been actually used in many countries, where now all the new electric cars come with their kind of license plate that is green, so that when you are kind of driving, you see these cars with green plates, and that helps to signal to you this small nudge that this is kind of positive behavior, a behavior we want to see, and look, there are more and more of these green vehicles that maybe otherwise you wouldn't have noticed. In other countries, like in Norway, for instance, they also use some other kind of small nudges to complement this. They created special kind of driving lines for electric vehicles to make it quicker. You get some small rewards like free passes to museums and so on for if you are driving an EV, or cheaper parking spots and so on. So you definitely need both layers, right? You need that big policy change, but also there are smaller kind of shifts that you can complement it with. So we use this, we call it upstream downstream model. You can operate on the downstream if we think of us as kind of swimmers swimming in this kind of big flow, and tell people, oh, why don't you start driving an EV? Why don't you reduce your energy usage and so on? And some people might respond to that if you design that kind of information well. But ultimately, if you want to see a big substantial shift, it has to come from upstream, from carbon taxation, from new infrastructure and so on. But the two approaches are complementary. The one last thing I would mention, perhaps for those interested, is our kind of go-to framework when trying to use this nudge approach is to say that if you want to encourage a behavior, you need to make it easy, attractive, social, and timely. And I would recommend for people to have a look at our report, where they'll find plenty of examples from different areas where we have shown that can be achieved by individual businesses or local and national government as well.
Great, thanks for that. I think we have Ashali's had a
Yeah, I'm
minor technical glitch, but she's back.
Sorry.
Ashali, you were still completing your response to the last question, but I also want to, and also there's a question in the chat which relates to the question I want to ask you, which is, why do we need new approaches, particularly in the context of Indian cities? You're an urban planner, and why do we need new approaches like the Urban Living Lab? Thoughts on that?
Absolutely, and apologies for my power outage. But yeah, I think I can try to weave in what I was saying earlier to answer this question as opposed to breaking the flow. But I think Urban Living Lab, the new approaches are desperately needed because our current planning structures are extremely top-down, centralized. If you look at how participatory planning is done in the majority of cities, we find that it's, for the most part, kind of superficial. And to actually ensure that we have meaningful voices and representation from communities and from people and from individuals and even from the private sector, from small businesses, it's really important to change the way that we plan. And climate change, specifically thinking about net zero and climate action, is even more complicated because there's a lot of uncertainty associated with climate change. We don't necessarily know exactly how things are going to pan out, what risks are going to emerge. There will be trade-offs that we will uncover over time while implementing net zero pathways. But urban living labs, especially, Solve is a great new approach because they're a boundary institution, they're a boundary organization. They're not directly inbuilt part of the government. So there are power dynamics and kind of biases that can be avoided if you're working in an urban living lab. And in that way, they can actually facilitate really meaningful, deep engagement. They have the opportunity to do new things. For example, create shared visions, host imagination workshops, think about the future in a really new and different way. And similarly, they allow us to test new solutions in a different way, right? If we look at the way Indian cities are structured, the way governance structures are there, if we wanted to do anything, you have to tender it out, and it's a really long process, right? But an urban living lab allows an organization like Full to root itself in the neighborhood or in a small city, work with communities, work with other stakeholders, and co-create and even test solutions, right? So as part of Full One, we did these cycling experiments, right? We blocked off parts of the road. We worked with some government stakeholders, but also private sector, right? And also community groups like cycling clubs to bring new people out to say, hey, if we block one stretch of the road, will you come out and cycle, right? And we were able to talk to people, talk to children, talk to adults, and really understand their perceptions in a way that maybe a government would not have, because there's a certain level of authority that's commanded when you go and speak to the city corporation, right? Similarly, I think one of the things I was trying to talk about earlier is the fact that through urban living labs, you can create new institutional and social arrangements. Because right now there is a lot of fragmentation, there are a lot of silos in our government structures. But as part of Pull One, we were actually able to go in to the government and say, we're going to people together. So we convened an interdepartmental committee on water resilience, an apex committee on non-motorized transport, and we brought people into the same room who are working on the same things but rarely talk to each other to actually talk about implementing these solutions, right? So that's the kind of thing an urban living lab can do. It challenges things that we currently have in place, and it allows for a lot of collaboration, which I think is urgently needed.
Okay, great. Thanks, Shali. Very, very exciting points. Unfortunately, I have to open the. I can't come back to the panelists with questions that I have running through my head. I have to give the floor to the 10 people who have kindly joined us for this conversation, and there are 2 questions, and let me pick them as I post them so maybe I think there's one question which is very specific about, as I understand, that in the context of kind of governance and financial challenges in small and mid-sized cities, you know, the word has been used as silver. What are the silver linings that are available? What are the nuggets? What are the perhaps, if I may interpret it as low-hanging fruits for building a resilient and inclusive net zero society? Are there any like win-win? Are there any easy solutions? Kiraji, you want to take that?
No, actually, it's a very interesting question. Actually, I mean, if I'd answer it from a secondary citizen. I think one of the issue, actually, the silver lining, is that the growing cities and the smaller cities are still closer to the ecosystems, and they have not actually gone to the level of where the ecosystems are just kind of only remains of the ecosystem. But I mean, so that way, I think the secondary cities have in a better shape. The second point, actually, which I would like to highlight here is that lot of development has yet to come. So there is a scope of integrating resilience and the climate adaptation processes in the development which is yet to come. So, I mean, there is a scope. I mean, there is a silver lining there also with the secondary cities or the cities which are growing. So there are 2 points actually which I would like to highlight here.
Thanks for that. There's one more question. I'm going to maybe pitch this to Ashali, and also encourage the audience to please post your questions in the Q&A chat. But there's a general question on the challenges that we have faced in getting pull off the ground.
Yeah.
Right. And how have those been addressed? Do you want to take that very quickly, and then I'll come back to Christina?
Sure. I mean, one of the things I can especially speak from Pull One and phase 1 of Pull, we did start in Jan 2020, and the pandemic showed up in March 2020 and definitely derailed our ability to do a lot of the work we were hoping to do. Meaningful stakeholder engagement and how that was to be conducted completely changed during the pandemic. Especially in the beginning of the pandemic in India, because there was very stringent lockdown rules. And so I think that, that was definitely one barrier in getting work off the ground. But also I think that, mainstreaming of these solutions was challenging because in Indian cities and with Indian governance frameworks, a lot of people change in the government, right? We worked with certain officers who were, given new posts over different times, and then we had to start from scratch, right? With a new secretary, or elections were held and there was a new mayor, a commissioner, and we do find that everyone is very receptive across the board. Everyone likes the idea. Everyone's interested in climate change and net zero, but kind of creating that institutional memory within the government when you're a boundary organization can be quite challenging. So those are two quick nuggets. Vikram, I don't know if you have any more in terms of your reflections from poll one that were challenges, but in the interest of time, I'll also stop here.
I mean, I think for me, the biggest challenge was regulatory support for testing, and I think that's the main thing, that the idea of kind of launching a solution in a city and seeing how society accepts it and so on and so forth is great. And we did some good ones, but you always need a government partner because, access to roads and so on and so forth, right? So that to me is the challenge. There has to be a strong government buy-in. We don't work in a city till we have an MOU at least in place, because you need that regulatory support. There is a question for Christina, which is like, interesting examples of nudges, and I think a lot of us are quite interested in understanding if you have successful examples in the context of climate change, where either the upstream interventions or the nudges have worked, like you gave us the example of taxes, and also like another question that I often have, which is implicit in the audience question, is are these sustained behavioral changes, right? And how do you ensure that these are sustained behavioral changes?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. So yeah, let me give you a couple of quick examples of some nudges in this area of sustainability. For instance, we worked in the UAE. We are working there a lot recently on food waste, working with restaurants and hotels, and there we have implemented a simple nudge. We have reduced the portion sizes that people get. And we found, having run a rigorous evaluation, that reduced food waste by 50%, right? And so that is a small change, an easy recommendation that you can give to restaurants, hotels, and so on. We are currently rolling it out with dozens of hotels, but immediately you see a big effect on food waste. In the UK, similarly, we have worked on trying to increase kind of adoption of plant-based diets. So we have found, for instance, that small changes in the names of the plant-based dishes can make them more attractive. So we again did a study in supermarkets and restaurants and found that twice as many people bought a field-grown breakfast compared to meat-free breakfast, even though it's the same dish. And going back to social norms, I mentioned the project we did on taxation. Actually, similar work has been replicated in the field of energy savings. So, utility companies sending kind of bills and letting people know that they actually are using more energy than some of the more efficient neighbors have led to small, but to your point, sustained decreases in energy usage of about 5% point. So these are small changes, typically come with small effect sizes, but that tend to be cost effective. And yeah, whether or not they are sustained in time depends on that kind of particular nudge, right? If you are reducing the portion size and that portion remains small, the odds are that it will be very hard for you to, waste more food and so on. But that's a bigger question. I don't want to, spend too much on, given we are at time.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think this 1 hour went really fast, and it's already 5:30, but I am going to take the liberty of a couple of minutes to kind of thank all the panelists for their time and for the participants to attend. I just want to say a couple of, a few things in the closing remarks. So first of all, we are at the onset of this journey, and although we claim to be great social scientists, I think we need, we're also discovering how to go about this kind of initiative in growing mid-sized cities, and so definitely both from the panelists and from the audience, invite interactions, collaborations, conversations to take us forward on this journey. And in terms of kind of making some sense of what the panelists had to say, I do think that Shirazji, my conclusion is that he's positive about the possibility of integrating development and net zero futures in growing mid-sized Indian cities, and he has tremendous experience. So I'm going to go with that judgment, and also I think we are working on urban ecosystems. I think that's a really critical point for some of our cities, especially our small cities, which are still connected in an interesting way with their rural hinterland, and I think that's where we have to avoid these trade-offs between kind of carbon-only approaches to biological approaches, and think about ecosystems in an integrated way. And I think I'm taking that forward as something that we will definitely work on and focus on, and definitely, Christina, really thank you for being here. And there is increasing research in the Indian context on behavioral change, but I think a lot of that research is in the field of health and adherence to vaccines and tuberculosis and so on and so forth. And in the domain of climate change, less so, right? So we're hoping to build that knowledge base and really, really hope to, build on some of the insights that you have shared. And the examples that you have shared, and thanks for that. And of course, Ashali is my colleague, and she is already in charge of the Urban Living Lab, and I'm glad to hear that she believes that it's a good way to move forward. So those are just some of my thoughts, and I just want to close this. I want to take 2-3 extra minutes, and thank you everybody for being here, and hope to hear from all of you soon enough.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye.